It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. Next up, Maggie Betts. Maggie is a relatively new filmmaker. She's only directed 3 films. There's The Carrier, a 2010 documentary about an HIV-positive pregnant woman in Africa. She also wrote and directed a short in 2014. Now she's written and directed her first feature film, Novitiate. It's set in 1964, a time when the Catholic Church was at a crossroads. Society was changing around it, attendance was down, and the church responded to all of that by executing a bunch of reforms, some popular, some not so much. Novitiate talks about that world by zooming in on a group of women training to be nuns. It focuses on the huge changes they experience as the church changes around them. Suddenly, all their rules change. It's a total change in their lives. The movie is lush, it's passionate, and it talks about faith in a really honest and kind of fascinating way. Here's a little bit from the beginning of the film. One of the movie's storylines follows a young woman named Kathleen, played by Margaret Qualley, as she goes down the path towards becoming a nun. In this scene, she's just told her mom, who's a single mom and agnostic, played by Julianne Nicholson, that she's joining a convent. Her mom thinks it's crazy.
A nun? What are you talking about? That's just crazy, Kathleen.
I knew you would understand. You don't have to understand.
It's not that I don't understand. It's just that it's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. You can throw your life away in some convent.
But I'm not throwing my life away. I don't know how you can
You're
even say that.
You're absolutely throwing your life away. Well, I don't get it. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to be a single mother?
But it's not about that. It has nothing to do with you.
Then what is it?
I'm in love, Mom.
You're in love with who? What? God? Oh my God, that's crazy. That is crazy. That doesn't even make sense. I'm in love with God.
I don't know how to explain this, but I was called, and I'm going to become a nun, and there's really nothing that you can say that's going to make me change my mind.
Maggie Betts, welcome to Bullseye. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for that.
Are you religious yourself?
I'm not. I didn't grow up with religion as a strong part of my background, but I was always quite fascinated by it, and particularly because my mother grew up very religious, and it's something that she sort of gave up or put to the side because of our family wasn't going to be church-going. And I was always quite touched by like the endurance of her faith and quite fascinated to sort of like examine what it is that she felt for God and things like that. So it's part of the effort behind the movie.
Were there other folks who were church going in your family, like your mom's parents or anything like that?
Yeah, my mom grew up heavily church going. She was Baptist, she is Baptist, and her entire family, she's a very big family. She has 13 brothers and sisters. And so all of my aunts and uncles, the church was their source of community, their source of strength. Like, it's a huge thing. You know, we would go on Mother's Day for my mom. We would go on sometimes on Easter, sometimes Mass for Christmas. Oftentimes when my dad was out of town and my mom would be alone, we grew up in New York in the city for the weekend, she would ask me if I would take her to church, escort her to church. And so I'd take her to Riverside Church because she lives on the Upper West Side. More as like something to do with her that I knew would make her happy.
So as somebody who went to an interdenominational church occasionally as a kid and, you know, maybe went to Baptist church with relatives sometimes, how did you end up becoming interested in the Vatican II?
It was a series of, it was totally by accident, and it was a kind of domino series of one thing leading me to the next. But years and years ago, I had sort of accidentally picked up a biography of Mother Teresa, who I knew little or nothing about. It was just like a book I picked up in an airport. Actually, it was called Come Be My Light. And it consisted of all these letters that she wrote during her life that were just so consumed with her love relationship with God and describing him as her husband, like a literal husband, not a symbolic husband. And the ups and downs and the volatility and the romantic extremes of this relationship So that was really sort of fascinating to me because I didn't know nuns were married to God, and I didn't know that the marriage was literal as opposed to symbolic, and I didn't know that they were experiencing levels of emotion about their relationships on par with any like sort of great, profound, all-consuming love relationship that I've seen between two human beings or have experienced myself. So that led me to sort of start reading a lot of ex-nun memoirs, not thinking of making a movie, but just out of a curiosity of like who these women once were. And as you sort of like dig into the small but really rich canon of memoirs of former nuns, they're almost entirely focused on two subject matters, which is their time period in novitiate and the impact of Vatican II. So it wasn't that I went looking for stories about Vatican II. I started with the subject of women being in love with God, and all of the material I found then led to Vatican II.
It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. I'm talking with the filmmaker Maggie Betts. Her debut film, Novitiate, is out now. Can you explain for folks who aren't Catholic or don't know their modern American history or modern world history, I should say, what the impact, roughly what the Vatican II was, and particularly what its impact was on nuns?
Sure, absolutely. So between the years of 1962 and 1965, and that's notable because it's like in this moment of great change in the 1960s, the Pope at that time was a man named Pope John the 23rd, and for a variety of reasons, kind of like sweeping the cobwebs up, trying to kind of like modernize and be in step with the times, at the same time trying to go back to the original teachings and liturgy of Catholicism. He initiated something called Vatican II a century before had been Vatican I. By and large, Vatican II was a very good thing. It was a series of reforms that came out of this 3-year conference, and the reforms were things that made the church more accessible. For example, one of the most cited ones is that previously the liturgy and the service would be in Latin and the priest would have his back turned, which is obviously like sort of super alienating and separating. The congregation felt distance. They didn't understand what the guy was saying, and he wasn't even looking at them. On top of that, there was an acknowledgement of other faiths, particularly Judaism, that sort of like they have a right to believe what they believe too. But one thing that happened is that they didn't invite sort of nuns into the conference, and nuns were a huge part of the church, and they made or suggested reforms for them that were sort of in step with this idea of progress, but didn't ask them. So some of the reforms they made for them, the whole idea was for them to get out into the world, to not be like locked in the confines of convents. Get out into the world, ladies, spread the word, live your lives. They didn't have to wear the habits anymore, which was hugely shocking to nuns. It's like as if you told guys in the army, like, you don't have to wear a uniform anymore, but that's their identity, that's their status. And then also that their status with God was reduced to the same thing as a regular practicing Catholic in essence. I think what they meant was to sort of keep that women should go out and live their lives, but my interpretation is sort of like such entrenched patriarchal sexism in making a decision like that for a group of people that haven't been invited into the conversation about the decision. And so as a result, 90,000 nuns exited from their convents. Many of them formed like very sort of feminist groups within the church that have been sparring with the Vatican for women's rights within the church ever since, and that was in the 1960s.
What was the practical impact on nuns who had been living a life that had been prescribed 100 years previous and largely centuries before that in a convent, wearing a special outfit, punishing themselves in certain ways? Like, how did their lives change?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. A lot of the memoirs I read, a lot of the memoirs I read covered the story that I wrote, meaning like what the experience of women being inside a convent, learning about Vatican II, and that it ends there, them being sort of in shock and with the sort of information that 90,000 women left. But a lot of the memoirs I read had two parts, and the second half was these women attempting to assimilate to go out into the world. And there are many nuns I met who were young and they married or found jobs or just sort of like it was a sort of girl interrupted moment when they were in their training or in their time period of a nun, and then their lives continued from there. But a lot of women, you know, maybe who were older and had been in there like 15, 20, 30, 40 years, had no tools to, it's like coming out of jail. They don't know, you know, they don't know how to use money. They don't know how to get an apartment. And then those who stayed, the institution has now changed the parameters of this relationship. How do you, but it's a very intimate relationship between these women and God. How do they figure that out for themselves? So, you know, it's just super complicated.
I want to play another clip from Novitiate. And in this scene, the convent has gotten the orders from the Archdiocese to implement the reforms of Vatican II. And one of the changes is that they will be getting rid of some of the extreme physical penance acts. And the Reverend Mother has basically been ignoring the orders. And so in this scene, the Archbishop comes to town and sits down to tea with the Reverend Mother.
Why don't you tell me what exactly you're having the most difficulty with? Just lay it all out for me.
I have no difficulty. I just happen to disagree with it, all of it. Not to mention, it's a slap in the face that the sisters weren't given any voice in the matter.
You honestly expected them to have their own voice, the sisters.
We are a part of this church, too.
Marie, that's not how it works.
I don't think you really understand what this will do to us. If we were to truly embrace all these changes, it will ruin the very institution of Catholic nuns as well.
Are you still encouraging all of your novitiates and postulants to perform extreme acts of penance on themselves? All that old medieval stuff? Because that's got to stop.
Never asked my girls to do anything for God that I haven't done myself.
Like I said, got to stop.
Have you ever felt as passionately about anything as these women who are becoming nuns feel about their relationship with God?
Yeah, my first love relationships, where you're just all in and you just are so enamored and overwhelmed, and you've just never experienced it before and you've never felt it before. And then kind of, I guess, part of the question of the movie has to do with like the notion of young women in love and like how much of it is a projection, you know, like in my situation, I could look at my first boyfriend and he was God to me. He was everything. He meant everything to me. And I hope he's not listening to this, but looking back, he was kind of a loser. You know what I mean? It's like I can't even believe that I would have spent 5 minutes on this guy. But when you're, you know, so it's kind of like, I could say, like, if you go on the assumption that God is not in a day-to-day relationship with these young women, then it's all a self-generated relationship, and you could be like, oh, are they crazy? Are they just imagining? But I can't really find a place where I could totally differentiate what they're doing from what I did with my first love relationship. That said, that's what it's like to be a young, passionate girl that just falls head over heels in love for the first time. The women who had been there 30, 40, 50 years, who were day in and day out struggling with their relationship with God, as Mother Teresa had, that's something I think more profound.
How do you make a movie about nuns in a convent? Like, what are the practical considerations of... You
mean on like a filmmaking level? Like technical?
Yeah, I mean, like, even how do you know, everyone's wearing black, you know, every single person. So how do you even approach challenges? Like, how do you make sure people's faces don't look like they're floating around?
Yeah, no, exposure was how we shot it, and the lighting and how you expose without too much contrast was a huge thing. I mean, it's like you have this black and white, you have these these two primary colors. But I mean, from a like, for a period piece based in the 60s, I can't tell you the great joy of having only one costume. That's incredible. You know what I mean? And one location that doesn't involve like picture cars and other stuff like that. So in that sense, like, it was like, you know, my costume director, like, costume designer, like, dressed them once and just sat back and like ate an apple with her feet on a chair for the rest of. That's not true at all. She worked her butt off. But I'm just saying, like, she didn't have to come up with a period look.
I don't think I realized how much of these women, at least as you've portrayed them in the film's lives, are defined by a lack of physical intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I knew that they weren't having romance or sex,
Mm-hmm.
but I was shocked that they couldn't hug each other.
Touch and hug, and yeah. I remember reading this one section in a memoir where this woman was describing how unbelievably starved for any type of physical contact, the slightest, like, anything. And they had some kind of feast day or some ceremony that came up every year, like literally maybe once a year, twice a year or something, where as a part of the ritual, one of the older nuns would kiss each young woman on the forehead. Maybe, I can't remember exactly what it was connected to, but this girl described desperately longing and waiting for that day because she just needed somebody to touch her so badly. And I just found it like incredibly moving. Even the way that they walk, which is called custody of the eyes, where you keep your eyes down as opposed to looking upward and making eye contact either with another person or with a flower or with the beauty of a landscape or something, is supposed to not let anything in that can kind of like, even something like eye contact is too much person-to-person interaction. It's taking you away from your meditation on God.
You're listening to Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. My guest is the film director, Maggie Betts. She has a new film. It's called Novitiate. One of the interesting things to me about the way that you tell the story is that movies about the Catholic Church tend to either be about the glory of God or, especially more recently, a kind of grand expose,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is an important story to be told.
Mm-hmm.
That is that's a huge part of our world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in the way that you've told this story, while there is this motivating context of the Vatican II, you're ultimately trying to represent something that is much more personal and much less a commentary about the institution.
Yeah, I think what I was really mostly interested in, and this is much, much broader than Catholicism or than this particular moment between 1962 and 1965 or the nuns, was the idea of like, and it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. You have this incredibly intimate relationship. Like in this situation, they're just they're going after the deepest level of intimacy in the form that comes in the form of relationship with God, for example. And then you have this enormous institution that's sole purpose is to regulate every detail of the relationship. And the conflict of that is what's really interesting to me. And you can see that, and you could apply that to a lot of different things in the world. But it's like, you could apply it to the notion of marriage or something like that. But it's like, you could apply it to gay marriage, you know what I mean? Like, it's like the most intimate relationship, and then you have these institutions that are like, this is what you're allowed to do, and this is how you get the person to love you back, and so I just found that generally the notion of a novitiate, the training program, is teaching you how to love, and love should be the most private, personal, instinctual thing inside us as human beings. And so I was like, this program that was set up within these convents is trying to regulate and control, and also harping on your worst insecurities when you're in love. And that was the thing for me.
I have an odd question to ask you, which is that you are or were housemates with Barbara Bush the younger, the daughter of George W. Bush and Laura Bush.
Mm-hmm.
Your father was or is pals with George W. Bush.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like when someone you know as a actual human being
Mm-hmm.
becomes president? You know what I mean? Like, it's like a president is such a weird, abstract thing, at least to me.
Yeah, it's like, wow, that happened. You know what I mean? It's like people, yeah, it's like, oh, okay. I mean, I don't. It's not something I would really know how to describe. It's just like, oh, that happened. It's complicated, but yeah, it's. I don't know if my dad, his relationship with George Bush goes back to them being at Yale together, and so I don't know if they were like, one of us is going to be president one day. But, yeah, I don't know how else to answer that.
I mean, I thought about your first film, which was a narrative documentary about an expecting mother with HIV
Mm-hmm.
in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I wondered when I was thinking about it, this, it's a subject that grew out of you doing service in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if it was like, in a way, like it's a way of doing art as an act of service that
Mm-hmm.
is part of giving yourself permission to do art
That's
as an
incredibly
act of
sort
art.
of psychologically astute for me personally in that movie at that time in life. It was like, you have a lot of guilt about what you're allowed to do in the world and what you're not allowed to do in the world. And I desperately wanted to make movies, but I didn't know if I was quote unquote allowed to do that for various reasons of maybe I'm too privileged and I haven't struggled enough. And also maybe because I'm a woman. And at that time it was so making an issue film about an issue which I don't want to diminish. Like, I take very seriously to this day, and it's still something that's deeply important to me. The issue is prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, so protecting mothers who are HIV positive, protecting their children from being born with HIV, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, where the pandemic is like the most raging. But yeah, I mean, there is something about what's permissible, and it was like, well, I guess in this sense, I never felt comfortable just like telling like what a lot of sort of indie filmmakers do, and to great effect. I'm not like the coming of age, like my life, that sort of like personal narrative, like thing, like it had to be something that had sort of some kind of socially conscious, and I'm still like that aspect to it. And maybe there's something in that in the sense that it's like, because the subject matter is more important to you, that's what makes it okay for you to want to do it, kind of thing.
Well, Maggie, I really appreciate you taking the time to come and be on Bullseye. I really
so
enjoyed
appreciate
getting to
you.
talk to you.
Enjoyed it. Yeah, enjoyed it a great deal. And thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Maggie Betts. Her film Novitiate is in theaters now. Go check it out.